Hello, and welcome to Of Significance, the statistics podcast where you can never extrapolate to where we're going. This week, we're celebrating with a Thanksgiving special where we'll talk about America's biggest pastime, football, and its second biggest pastime, food. I'm your every person host, Brent Buckwright, here with two experts who have been analyzing big data since before it was big. It's Dr. Nathan Woods and Dr. Steve Bronars. When it comes to the sample size of dishes during Thanksgiving, we can all agree that no sample is large enough. Folks, how are you?
Great. I'm doing fantastic. I can't wait to talk about Thanksgiving.
I'm excited about Thanksgiving. I'm excited about football, but I'm not as dialed into the sports world as y'all. As I understand it, football is all about setting up the most important event of the season, the Super Bowl halftime show. And there's a component of it that's called a kickoff. Is that true?
Yes, that is
okay. I definitely understand what that is. But for the listeners at home, what is the kickoff and why is the NFL trying to change such a proud and glorious institution?
Well, I'll jump in on that, Brent. So the kickoff, it's the beginning of the whole thing, right? So you kick off at the beginning of the game. You kick off at the beginning of the half. You kick off after somebody has scored. It's exciting, especially because it's the beginning of something. It's also tremendously fast. Somebody is starting and kicking the ball from pretty far away. Somebody else is starting and receiving the ball. There's a lot of high speed, high impact collisions. So it's both exciting, but also historically pretty dangerous. You can get hurt on kickoffs. So that's why they're thinking about changing the kickoff as a proud institution, in that you want to retain the excitement. You want to make sure that it is actually an entertaining part of the game, but you want to minimize the downside risk of getting hurt.
Yeah, and Nathan, they actually did change the rule. I know you don't watch that much football, but it's a different kickoff in 2024 than it was before this. Yes, it is.
Oh, my God.
One other thing I would point out before we talk about the rules is that it's a risk-reward thing, that when the ball is kicked off, if you choose to run, there's going to be high-impact collisions, pretty likely. Could be some injuries. But you don't have to do that. You can always just take what's called a touchback. You kneel down, and then you just get the ball at a certain point. And so it's a very safe option strategically, and it's also safe for the participants, the players, because there's not going to be any injury if there's no real run back and collision. So it's kind of interesting. Over the years, they've changed the rules. I think the first time they really changed it was in the 70s, because before that, probably before your time, the way that they kicked the ball in football was like straight on from your toes. And
the toe poke?
Yes.
And then they said no toes allowed in this sport.
Kickers were
you can't use your feet at all in this dang game.
And the kickers, if you saw them, they were like kind of linemen, overweight, chubby, not all that athletic. And then they started bringing in these like little European guys that had played this thing called soccer, and they would kick the ball so much further and more accurately that they decided we've got to move back the spot where the kicker is kicking from, because if you just kick the ball out of the field of play, then it automatically goes to, at that time, the 20-yard line, and there effectively was no kickoff. So they moved it back, and then in the 90s, they moved it back again because they wanted more kickoffs, more excitement. And they weren't really thinking about concussions as much and injuries. And they said, no, these kickers keep getting better. We've got to make them kick from further away. And the way the rules have always been until this year is like all the people that are going to do the tackling are lined up where the kicker is. And so they're getting that real head of steam as they're going 60, 65, 70 yards downfield. So this year they changed it for the first time. And if you look at it, it looks kind of different because the kicker is in one spot and they brought together the players that are going to be doing the running back and the tackling so they're closer together. Mm-hmm. So the kicker still kicks it from far away because everybody knows how to kick like a soccer player now. And they kick it really far. And so that's really what's happened. And the hope was you're still going to get these returns. When you have the collisions, people haven't had a chance to build up as much momentum. And so maybe there'll be fewer injuries. Hopefully there'll be fewer injuries. It'll still look exciting to the fans. There's still the opportunity of running it back. And they've also, over time, to try to discourage people from running it back and instead taking the safe touchback, they change it to automatically get at the 20-yard line and then the 25, and this year all the way up to the 30. So there's a pretty safe option, which is just take a knee, get at the 30-yard line, or you could try running it out, and you may do better than that or worse than that, and there's some variation in what the outcomes would be. And the hope was that all those combination of rules would lead to a safer game, but it would still be exciting.
So the NFL's goal is to have more returns, but make each return have a lower collision and have fewer injuries. How would we be able to tell whether or not this rule change actually was successful?
Well, I think there's better and worse ways of doing it. A very simple way of doing it would just be to compare relative to last year. And you would hope in that very simple comparison to at least be able to assume that nothing else, at least nothing else that was really important, had changed. You didn't have a different rule change or some really different strategy of play that might be incorporated between the 2 years. But that would be the simplest way, is just to compare it to last year in the NFL. And I think that's a little different than, Major League Baseball had a set of rule changes a couple of years ago, and they had been testing those out for years in minor league baseball stadiums. So they knew kind of already what to expect when they implemented those rules in a major league setting. What you can't do, I don't think very well, is compare it to some other simultaneous NFL equivalent league that doesn't change that rule. I mean, I guess you've got college football. As I understand it, these rule changes came in part because of an experience with the XFL, but the XFL is a pretty different game, I think, for lots of reasons. So it's really hard to compare sort of side by side whether or not the rule change is making a difference. So I think you've got to think about it kind of across time.
Right. And so far, up to this point, I looked at the data that's available, and last year, about 22% of kickoffs were being returned rather than taking a knee. And this year it's 32%. So in a typical game that has about 10 kickoffs, you're going from 2.2 times when people are running up and down the field, having these collisions, to 3.2 times. And that's a 45% increase. Or put another way, since there are 282 games in total in the league each year, there's going to be about one more return per game. That's 282 more collisions per year that you're going to have, presumably from these kickoff returns. So that we can measure, I think, pretty well. And you might want to look back. I just looked at the previous year. We'd look back at earlier years. There have been different trends up and down. It could depend on changes in some of these other things that Nathan was talking about. But I think the easier part is to measure, okay, are there more returns? The answer is yes, there are. And it's benefiting the offense, because even when they don't run it back, they're getting the ball further down the field. So it's changed the game in a number of different ways. But I think, like Nathan is saying, it's not really like your randomized controlled trial where you go, like, in half of the games we'll do it this way and the other half we'll do it that way. And then
that would be fun.
Well, that would be pretty interesting. And we'll just compare the outcomes between those two games. So we have to do it from 1 year to earlier years. And that would be a way in which you would explore this. But I think just the fact that there were more returns in the first part of the season, at least, you have to hope that these collisions are less
right. You
violent.
You could have more returns, and therefore you're going to get more collisions. But maybe the collisions are less serious, and they're not career ruining, or they don't set out a major player for a larger number of games.
Yeah. And right. That is what the NFL is going. They want more returns. They don't want you to take a knee in the end zone, but they also don't want to take that trade-off of increased injury risk. So we know for sure there's going to be more returns. I don't think we know yet whether or not there's more injuries.
Right. And I should point out that some of our colleagues here at Edgeworth, Jesse David, Mike Kafitz, they did a study of an earlier change when they changed the location of where the kicks were coming from, but it was a smaller change than we've seen.
This is like
recently.
In 2011,
2012 in there. And then they also lengthened the season, which of course a longer season means more violent collisions. And they did a study of how that would affect the number of injuries, length of player careers, all those kind of things. Because the other thing you have to remember is that, if you're a player that's on the field returning the kick, that's your chance to really shine. You could score a touchdown. You could move the ball downfield. You want to get out there and show what you can do. The players who are in those positions are not typically the star players who are already, playing on the offensive team, let's say. So they're going to be out there and they're going to take chances. Obviously, their coach, don't take chances if it's not in the team's interest. And the other thing I would say is that like a lot of other football decisions, it's a strategic decision. So, for example, if you're ahead in a game, you're probably going to take the knee. You get a safe outcome. You're not going to fumble the ball, turn it over. You certainly won't score a touchdown. So you're going to do that more often. If you're behind in the game and you need to score quickly, especially as the game is getting towards the end, you're going to run it out. You're going to tell the player, run it out, take your chances. There are going to be more of these collisions. So where these extra returns are going to be occurring are going to be in certain specific instances when the teams are taking more chances because they're behind, because they need to score quickly. And so, the decisions behind this are related to kind of sports analytics in general, which I'm sure we'll talk about more in future episodes. But in football, I think the most prominent kind of study, and there was an economic study in 2006 that said these teams aren't going for it enough on fourth down, because in football, you have 4 downs, 4 chances to try to make it 10 yards. Mm-hmm. So in fourth down, you either kick it to the other team or you can try to hang on to the ball and keep going forward. And if you have a short enough distance to go in fourth down, you go like, well, our chance of making it should be pretty good. Maybe we should go for it, because if we kick the ball away, then the other team's going to have the ball and they could score. And, it's much harder to score if the other team has the ball instead of you. And it led to a lot of, maybe not just this one paper by the economist who wrote it, David Romer at Berkeley, but there was a lot of interest in that. And I think as analytics has worked its way into the NFL, these decisions that are being made, and they even say it on the game, like the analytics say they should go for it here, or they should do this, or they should do that. And it's based on just historical data. I think, in some future episode, we'll talk more about that, but it's an interesting aspect of these games that it's not just gut, reactions or emotion that determines what decisions are made. Whether the player runs the ball out on the kickoff or takes a knee is very context dependent.
Yeah. And I mean, it kind of goes to the point that we make probably in many episodes, which is there's a lot of factors going on. There's a lot of context. Beginning of the game, end of the game, what's the score, situation dependent stuff, which you'd want to take into account. And then certainly, some of what you see with the injury rates, it's not even injuries specific to kickoffs, right? So you'd want to tie the injuries that you're assessing to the actual kickoff event for sure, if you're trying to model this thing.
Right. Your quarterback is never going to be on the kick return team or the coverage team. So
which, by the way, is another rule change that maybe we can talk about a little bit later.
Well, let me ask you this. What's a quarterback?
The players who make the most money.
Yeah.
And, So you would want to, if you did a more sophisticated study, not just do this before and after the rule change, but take into account some of these other factors. I mean, this is definitely a high priority for the league, for the Players Association, to not have as many concussions. There are a lot other changes that players are, like if you're the quarterback, you can slide rather than get tackled, and you're not supposed to get hit then. And so as the players learn about how to properly tackle people or how to avoid getting hit, you'd expect injury rates to go down. So you need to factor that into okay, what happened in 2024 relative to earlier years? Maybe some of the decline in injury rates, if that's actually what occurred, could be due to some of these other changes in behavior.
Okay, so I've got a question about modeling this. And if we were to try and analyze this, obviously you'd want to control for a bunch of factors. One thing we talk about all the time is, do we have a good enough snapshot of data? Do we have a reasonable enough sample? Is our population going to reflect some meaningful statistic that we can interpret? So my question for you is, if we look at 1 year's worth of data, do we feel like we would be able to say whether this rule has changed people's behaviors, or is it possible that even controlling for all these factors, you need to have multiple years of information?
You have in a typical season between 2,500 and 3,000 kickoffs across all the different teams. So if you thought that this was something that happened league-wide, that's a pretty good number of observations. Now, it could be 20 to 30% of those returned, so they're not all returned. But I think it's over the course of a season, you have a pretty good sample size. But if there's enough heterogeneity, enough differences, you might want to say, well, it's these situations were different than others, and then we get into this issue related to stratification and other stuff. But I think that it's a very reasonable start. I think you would want to like follow up for more than just 1 year, because certainly the teams are going to learn about, hey, how do we do this with the new rules? And they may be behaving differently later in the year than early in the year.
Well, yeah, I mean, and you're correct, Steve. I follow just about no American football anymore. But one thing I did notice,
even the fact that you say it's American football is just a weird thing to me.
He's very posh that way. You notice?
What other kind of football is there?
Let's we're going to do a whole separate episode.
Did you know his name is actually Nathaniel?
Liverpool, Liverpool FC. But they have different kinds of people back there receiving the kicks now than they used to, and so even that factor has changed just from last year to this year, which kind of makes it a little bit complicated to say, can we just talk about injury rates if it's a different kind of athletes that's back there to receive now than maybe used to be the case, with a different strategy for moving the ball up the field once they get the ball. So I mean, it is pretty different. I think for sure you'd want more data rather than less. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't be making observations and saying smart things about what the results show, at least as an initial matter. I mean, we're talking about it partway through the first year. That's okay. I think we can talk about it with 1 year of data, and it'll be even better after you've got a couple. But you do need to think about those other factors, those other confounding factors that might be varying from year to year.
So I'm going to bring up one other thing, which is somewhat related to this, and it just shows you how important the situation is during the course of the game for the decisions that are being made. For reasons that aren't worth going into in too much detail, there's this thing called an onside kickoff, which is like, our team is going to kick the ball, but we want to catch it before the other team gets it, or the other team's going to fumble it. So you kick it a very short distance, and then it's a scramble for who's going to get the ball. It's usually not very successful at all. A few percent of the time it works, but you try it at the end of the game when you desperately need to get the ball back and score. So it's not a wise policy to take on average, but it'd be like in hockey or in the other kind of football, pulling your goalie and having one more attacker out there. Not a good long run strategy, but you're desperate. So
in the moment,
in the moment, right? The rate at which those onside kicks occurred is not significantly different between 2023 and 2024, even though now the element of surprise is completely gone because you have to announce it given the way in which the players are lined up. And so what that tells me is that even when they were trying onside kicks before, it wasn't really a surprise element because everybody knew, well, you're going to do this onside kick thing because you want to keep the ball. And, occasionally maybe there's a surprise one, but more often than not, it's as predictable as the quarterback at the end of the game just taking a knee to end the game, or pulling the goalie in hockey or in soccer it's just what you do, even though the chances of that really succeeding are very, very low. So there are going to be similar things, not as drastic as that are just going to dictate what is going to happen. You're going to, at certain times, it doesn't matter what the rules are. You say, we have to run the ball back because we need to score quickly. And that's what we're going to tell the player to do, even if it doesn't seem like that would be the wisest thing to do if it were the beginning of the game and the score was tied.
So if we know a rule change like this it's going to change teams' incentives, maybe over time they might learn to play the game a little bit differently given the rule change. But the initial evidence is that more collisions are going to be happening as a result. Why can't we just get rid of the kickoff and have people start at the exact same point every game?
Or just drop the ball out there at random spots.
I love that. If it was like a randomized drone.
Yeah, that's right. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Well, I think kickers might be disappointed not to have the opportunity. And Steve alluded to this earlier. There's a whole chunk of people that are in the league because they're playing on special teams. Now there are other special teams, but the kickoff team is for sure one of them. So, I mean, I think there would be some disappointment from some players that are not given opportunities because the kickoff team goes away. So that might be one reason not to get rid of the kickoff altogether.
Yeah, I think that generally fans find it to be a exciting play when the player runs it out. What I learned is that, like last year, that only happened a little over twice a game. And so the lower the rate at which that exciting thing happens, I think the less costly it is to just say, let's just automatically do the touchback. So I think it's really going to depend on the safety concerns relative to how much excitement it adds to the game for fans. And I think if you could find that sweet spot and say, let's have more of these returns, but each of them being less risky, that might be an interesting solution to this. But to me, it's related to a very famous paper many, many years ago in economics talking about seatbelts and safety. And it's like, well, the safer you make a car by having seatbelts or now, airbags and things like that, the less, according to incentives, the less careful people will drive. Now, it's bad if you're a pedestrian, you're on a bicycle, if people are driving not that carefully. But it's not always the case that making something safer per drive out there or per kickoff is going to have as much of a beneficial effect on the number of injuries as you might think, because here it's incentivizing them also to return it more. So there's a balancing act there.
Well, and it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that I read that was very interesting is that kickers are now way more likely to be making the tackle or in on the tackle than they used to be. And
they're the last line of defense for sure, because they're way back.
Right.
And they could get hurt.
And so there's right. And so maybe we're going to bring back the toe poking, Dip Butkus types to kick off again. But yeah, you might have fewer injuries, but the injuries just fall on different people, like the poor little kicker.
That's a good point.
Well, there's tons of things about football I'll never understand, like why tailgating isn't the entire game, how people stay interested in 14 minutes of play over the course of 3.5 hours, or how my home team, the Falcons, lost the 2016 Super Bowl. They were just so far ahead. So let's wrap up with a little Thanksgiving ranking activity. I'm going to list a set of sides, and you're going to rank them from best to worst in a game I'm calling What's My Side? First category is vegetables. No one really cares about these, but you have to include them. Green bean casserole, corn, and carrots. Steve, let's start with you. Best to worst?
I would put corn at the top. This is not even really that much like a vegetable. And I have this weird, likeness of the green bean casserole. I mean, it's a kind of a gross thing when you think about it, but if you don't have it that often, I think it's a little bit different. And the carrots are just more of like a everyday thing. So I'd go corn, green bean casserole, carrots in that order.
So close, but green bean casserole is terrible.
What?
Shouldn't even be on the list.
That's crazy. Go defend yourself.
I think it's the cream of mushroom soup that gets him.
Yeah. Forget about it.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. I mean, green bean casserole has got to be number one for me. It's got great crunch. You can get some bright green beans, the creaminess of the
Well, you must have had
sauce.
some better green bean casseroles than some.
Yeah. I didn't have depression era green bean casserole. So
it's got a higher ceiling.
Yeah. I mean, for me, corn is the lowest.
Is it really?
Yeah, of course. Corn it's boring unless you add 8 other things to make it exciting. Or you're picking corn kernels out of your teeth.
Which brings us to our next category.
Sauces. Cranberry sauce, gravy, or other. And there's not a ton of sauces that are involved in Thanksgiving, but I have thrown in some different ones for myself. One I really like, it's not common in American cuisine, but chimichurri makes for a great Thanksgiving sauce. But I would have to put gravy as number one, chimichurri, and then cranberry sauce is generally trash. And I'm referring to the canned garbage that people seem to love to slice into Frisbees.
I'm fascinated by that cranberry in the can thing, but I can't put it very high on the list. But it just is like an intriguing thing to me that people buy that. I got to go, gravy number one. I'd have to try your chimichurri.
Yeah.
I think it has a higher ceiling. I know what you're getting with that cranberry sauce of any type, and it's got a low ceiling.
Yeah.
So I'd go with
you don't have to pick my chimichurri. You could pick another sauce if you wanted to, like Hershey's chocolate syrup or just pure mustard. Anything you want. Nathan, what do you say?
Yeah, pure mustard sounds terrible. Gravy for sure, especially, we're talking about Thanksgiving here. It's got to be gravy. Chimichurri, I like that idea. I do like the idea of other alternatives. I think all of us should branch out a little bit on Thanksgiving. You get the tried and the true, no doubt about it. It's tradition.
Yeah.
But maybe every year, try a little bit something new. So, add a little spice to your cranberry sauce and don't open a can to make it.
All right. So this last category is probably the most controversial one. This is the top contenders for most people's ranking lists of best Thanksgiving sides. It's the starches. You've got your mashed potatoes, mac and cheese, and stuffing or dressing. Nathan, I want to start with you.
It's got to be mashed potatoes. And that's half the reason why you're having gravy is with the mashed potatoes.
What's your worst?
I mean, I'm not sure there's a worst.
You have to pick one that's the worst, and you are saying you hate this one. Those are the rules of what's my side.
What are the options again?
Mashed potatoes, mac and cheese, and stuffing / dressing.
I'm going to say the worst is stuffing / dressing, because when I was a kid and people referred to it as dressing, I thought of salad.
Yeah.
And salads are all bad. So even though I found out later that it's not really salad.
It's nothing like a salad.
It's nothing like a salad.
But when you say dressing, I think, vinaigrette, and I don't want it.
Well, the fact that it doesn't contain any of that means that the misinformation campaign worked. Steve, what about you?
They're all great. I mean, I hate to put any of these.
You have to.
I know.
That's the nature of this game.
I'd have to say stuffing number one, mostly because you don't really have it that often.
I wonder why.
Yeah. Whereas mashed potatoes.
We love stuffing once per year.
But it's a traditional thing. So if you didn't have that, I'd say you'd be missing something. Mashed potatoes, I would say, would be number two. And if it was a good enough mac and cheese, it could compete with it, but it'd have to be pretty good to be better than mashed potatoes because of the gravy. I think that's like the 1-2 punch there.
I would
don't put gravy on your mac and cheese.
I would probably say mashed potatoes are number one. I'd put stuffing as number two, even though I think it's just a savory bread pudding and is basically gross. But I think mac and cheese doesn't really have business being on a Thanksgiving table. It's often way overcooked. It often is too congealed. It doesn't work for the kind of family style settings where you're making this massive amount of food because it's sitting out there for too long. Mac and cheese is great on its own. Love it. It's an all-star. But at Thanksgiving, often disappointing. That's our episode. We hope you all have a happy Thanksgiving. Eat too much and look at more statistics.
And watch some world football.
Well, that's been this episode of Significance. This episode's been brought to you by Edgeworth Economics, a leader in economic consulting, and with the help of our producers Kimberly Krewald, Ryan Deal, and Brian McLamara of Brand Ready Media, with music by Armwell Lang. Thanks for listening, StatPack, and always remember to check your assumptions.